the executive committee. So there's your warning. And the executive committee would like to express thanks to our honored presenters, and we will place their expanded bios in the chat and you can take a look at them. We'd like to begin with Caroline Schmidt, and let me tell you a little bit about Caroline's background. She works in the Population Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. She's been working with the UN since 1955 in various capacities, serving at different duty stations around the world. Caroline is currently heading the Fertility and Population Aging section in the Population Division, leading the division's work on population aging and fertility. In this capacity, she has led research on social, economic, as well as health-related aspects of demographic dynamics. Caroline holds a diploma in sociology from the University of Hamburg, Germany, and a PhD in sociology from the University of Marburg, Germany. So thank you for joining us today, Caroline, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Marcia, for your kind introduction, and thank you to the NGO committee to invite us, the Population Division, to contribute. I think it's a very good occasion for us also to share our work and to make known what we do. And I'm very happy to see that you've received a copy of the aging report. That's one of the big flagships that we have been working on with two other divisions, the Division for Inclusive Social Development. And I've worked there as well, and I know Renata very well. So I'm really happy to see, to have seen this coming to fruit. So without further ado, let me go to my presentation. And now let's hope technology will stay with us and the gods will be in favor of us and all goes well. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So the topic of my presentation is Population 8 Billion, Considerations for Families. My presentation will touch a bit on the, now let's see. Yes, my presentation will touch on a little bit on the concept note, address some of the points made, like where are we going after the demographic transition, what type of landing can we expect. I will, in my presentation, provide a brief introduction to the work of the Population Division, then dig into the demographic transition, where are we and where are we going. Look then at fertility and population growth, level and trends and related projections. I will then introduce a data set we've been compiling and pulling together on household and living arrangements. That also has a sub-data set. I will not draw on that. That also looks specifically at living arrangements of older persons. And I conclude my presentation with some thoughts, remarks on population and sustainable development. What is the Population Division doing? We conduct demographic research. We do a lot of data mining, collecting data on themes such as fertility, population aging, mortality, family planning, marriage, migration, policy levels and trends, urbanization, SDG related. And we conduct demographic research. We support in the governmental processes in the area of population and development. And we also do, to a rather limited extent, provide technical assistance to countries to produce and analyze demographic data. Now to the main part of my presentation, demographic transition. Where are we and where are we going? This part of the presentation draws on the every 2 years released update the world population prospects. We released the last version, a complete overhaul of the data set last year. And we know that pretty much all countries have now entered the demographic transition. That is the transition from high levels of fertility and mortality to low levels of fertility and mortality that started in Northwestern Europe around 1800. These advances have led to rapid population growth that is still ongoing in some parts of the world, but it's coming slowly to an end. These changes are the result of better sanitation and medical therapies, greater access to education and family planning, and strides towards gender equality and women's empowerment. It's a success story. Oftentimes we look at the transition, population aging as a challenge, as something negative, but we all know what the alternative is. If we don't live long and healthy lives, we all die early. And I think all of us are happy that we have passed the stage that children that are born, women who bear children, young men, that people live longer, live healthier lives, and can expect more and more to live longer and contribute and benefit from society and what a life has to offer. It is also accompanied by a gradual but a permanent shift towards longer, as I said, and quite often also healthier lives. And if you dig into the report that you just showed, we explore in more detail what it means and also discuss the differences in different parts of the world. But it also means, in some cases, declining populations and smaller families. I've taken one graph from the report just to showcase briefly what does population aging mean, how does it look in absolute numbers, and sometimes it's important just to look at those numbers. We expect the number of people age 65 to double from 2021, 760 million to more than 1.6 billion in 2050. And we all know 2050 isn't too far away. Societies will be older. Right now, we have 1 in 10 people globally being 65 and older. And in 2050, we expect that to be 1 in 6 people. I don't have time in this presentation, but I think we also have to be aware of the gender differences, that women generally outlive men, and what this means for societies, what this means for families. How do we support women? How do we care for older persons? And we all know who is doing most of the care work is women who care for children, is women who care for older persons, who really take on a lot of that responsibility. Another interesting fact is that the population aged 80 and over is also growing very fast. And we expect a 3 times increase from 150 million right now to over 450 million. We also see aging. In the 80s, it was Sweden was one of the oldest countries, with 16% of its population being 65 and older. Right now, I guess most of you have heard it's Japan with 30%. And the Republic of Korea in 2050 is expected to have 40% of its population being 65 and older. Now let's have a look at fertility levels and trends, again, drawing from the population estimates and projections we are producing in the population division. In 2021, the average fertility of the world's population stood at about 2.3 births per woman over a lifetime. That had come down from about 5 births in the 1950s. And global fertility is projected to fall to 2.1 births per woman at the global level in 2050. But, and I found this interesting, and that's why I thought I share that also with you, despite the continuing decline in the average number of births per woman, the total number of births has remained rather stable at around 140 million since the late 1980s, when the large baby boom cohorts, the 50s and 60s, were having their children. In 2021, according to the data we have, around 134 million babies were born, and we even expect a slight increase to about 138 million babies born annually between 2040 and 2045, again, despite of the steady decline in the average number of births for women. Where do we think as a population division where our fertility levels and trends are going? We assume a continued decline of fertility for countries where women are having on average more than 2 births over a lifetime. We expect a slight increase in the level of fertility for countries where women are having on the average fewer than 2 births per lifetime. And that is information we draw from recent surveys in low fertility countries with fertility levels below the replacement level, where countries have experienced a slight rebound, but that does not mean a rebound even close to the replacement level or beyond. But we found in these surveys that women would indicate that they have fewer children than they actually would like to have. The responses to the survey have also told us that addressing constraints such as the demands of higher education, high costs of childcare, balancing work-family relationship and challenges, addressing the still present unequal division of household tasks between partners, and as well as care responsibilities, not only for children, but also for aging parents and other family members. And of course, women have the biological clock tick, and we all know you want the career, you want the life, you want education, and at some point time is running out. You have to find the appropriate partner who is willing and able and interested to commit and to have a family. So to bring all of this together isn't easy, and with the increased growing demand, particularly on women, it's a challenge for many. And if some of these issues would be addressed and could be addressed, that would definitely help individuals and also families to have the family size, the number of children they actually would desire. I'm sharing with you fertility levels and trends. What you can see here in the graph is live births per woman from 1950 to actually 2100. That is the time frame for which we do our population estimates and projections. I don't know if you can see the cursor when oh good. Yep. Replacement fertility is generally assumed to be at 2.1 births per woman over a lifetime. And we definitely see for all regions in the world that fertility has come down and continues to come down. But if we look at the countries at the brown and the green line, we also see the blue line where we see fertility has reached below replacement levels already in 1990, where we see slight upticks, but it would continue to come down again. And we assume, as I said earlier, that those countries that have and regions that have come below the replacement level would gradually see a slight uptick of their fertility levels towards 2100. But those regions with high fertility, meaning fertility above the replacement level, like sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, Western Asia, and others are expected to continue to experience a continued decline in fertility. Now let's have a look at population growth levels and trends. We have just observed the 8 billion population day in November 22. We expect that the population at the global level will continue to grow to 9 billion by 2037 and to 10 billion at around 2058. Rates of population growth vary significantly across countries and regions. And more than half of the projected increase in the global population up to 2050 is concentrated mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and 2 countries in Asia, and these are the Philippines and Pakistan. We also found that the populations of 61 countries or areas are projected to decrease by 1% or more between 2022 and 2050. Due to sustained low levels of fertility, and in some cases also or because elevated levels of emigration. The countries with at least 500,000 people who experienced the largest relative reductions in population size until 2050, with in some cases losses of 20% or more, are expected to occur in Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Serbia, and the Ukraine. Of course, the data we have do not take into consideration the impact of the war in Ukraine. But even without the war, we definitely expect Ukraine to be amongst one of those countries that will see a decline in its population. I'm now introducing to you the other data set that actually my team is working on, pulling together information from surveys, censuses, and administrative data on household and living arrangements of representing approximately 98% of the world's population in 2022. And we cover a time period of about 60 years and pretty much covering all UN member states. We have data from 196 countries. Of course, the data sources, it varies. We don't have the most recent data from a lot of countries, but oftentimes it takes a lot of time for countries to make available even samples of their population censuses. Like larger countries, we don't have the last census from China, we don't have India, so some of the bigger countries. So we have to make do with what we have, but I think it's a unique data set that that we have maintained over now, I think 6 or 7 years. Briefly, to give you an understanding what households are and what they are not are. Households are entities where one or more people make provisions for food or other essentials of living. We know that families must be related, whereas household members can, but must not be related. A household can also constitute of one family or more than one family, or it can be a combination of people who are related or who are unrelated. The key is that common provision for food and or for other essentials of living. That is a definition that's been provided by the UN Statistics Division, and that is also applied globally for surveys, censuses, and also administrative data, just to make sure that we, at least to some extent, use common definitions and concepts when these data are collected, and to make sure data are comparable and can be summarized and reviewed, comparing across countries, but also across timelines. The trends we see indicate that in most countries, the average household size has declined over the recent decades. But as also with other demographic indicators, we see that this decline is not universal. Average household size has remained rather stable in high fertility populations in Africa. And declines in other countries, parts of the world, are slow but steady. I picked just a handful of countries, but if you're interested, you can check the website and look at the countries you're interested in more detail. In Austria, for example, we had almost 3 persons per household in 71, and that number has come down to 2.3 persons in 2011. In Poland, there were 2.3 persons per household in 1978, and that came down by 0.4 of a person on the average in 2011. In the US, that for which we have one of the oldest and longest time series, the earliest data from 1960, where 3.3 persons formed the household, and it has come down by almost 1 person to 2.5 persons on the average in 2010. And in Hungary, 3.3 persons lived in a household according to the data we have in the 1970s, and 2.4 persons in 2011. Now I also took a quick look at the presence of children. According to our definitions, we count as children any member in a household under 20 years of age. And that also varies considerably across countries and regions. Not surprisingly, we found that households in Africa and Asia are much more likely to include a young person than households in Europe or Northern America. More than 96% of households in Afghanistan and Niger include at least one member under age 20, whereas in Austria, Switzerland, and Hungary, less than 30% of households include somebody under age 20. The largest number of children and adolescents with more than 4 children in the household are found in Senegal and Gambia, as well as in Afghanistan, Iraq, Chad, and Yemen. Whereas in households in Eastern and Southeastern Europe and in Latin America and the Caribbean, we find on the average 2.2 children and even less than 2 children in the case of Europe and Northern America. I now conclude with a couple of thoughts related to population and sustainable development. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? We know sustained high fertility and rapid population growth presents challenges to the achievement of sustainable development. The need to educate a growing number of children takes away the resources to improve the quality of the education of children and young people, and also continuing the workforce. We also know that a rather useful population presents an opportunity for accelerated growth in rapidly growing countries, but only if a substantial and sustained decline in fertility levels is appearing at the same time. That would increase the share of the so-called working age population and would thus allow countries to maximize the potential benefit of the so-called demographic dividend. But we know it's not only a demographic number game. Really taking advantage of the so-called demographic dividend takes a lot of resources, takes political will, takes investment in healthcare, education, productive employment, decent work. And we are actually just starting a study where we look at a couple of countries in the least developed world, where we look at Asian countries and African countries, what are actually their opportunities taking advantage of this demographic dividend. Are there any options, or are the countries overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of people they will have to educate, provide healthcare, provide food, nutrition, while at the same time struggling with environmental changes, political instability, and civil unrest, and of course also developmental challenges, less resources available from the developed world to support countries in these transitions. We also think that moving the global economy towards greater sustainability requires a progressive decoupling of the growth in population and in economic activity from the further intensification of resource extraction, over-reliance on fossil fuels, waste generation, and environmental damage. And last but not least, I think we all know, but it has to be stated again and again, that the countries that have been contributing the most to unsustainable patterns of production and consumptions are generally those with high per capita income and where the population is growing slowly, if at all, and not those countries where income per capita is low and population are still growing rapidly. I leave it at that. I have shared with you the presentation. If you are interested to dig in more into the resources we have, feel free. I've highlighted a couple of links, but there is much more available. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Caroline. Appreciate that and the overview of population dynamics and trends and assumptions going forward. Especially appreciated the overview of the opportunities and the challenges that come with population change. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about those in the Q&A. We'll move to our next presenter, and that is Mr. Lyman Stone. And Lyman is the Director of Research at the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence and a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. He formerly worked as an international economist for the USDA Foreign Agricultural Service. And Lyman's work has been covered in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Vox, and the Federalist, as well as numerous other local outlets. Lyman has an MA in International Trade Policy from the George Washington University and is currently a PhD student at McGill University. Lyman is regarded by many to be one of the world's foremost researchers on factors associated with birth rates. And we welcome you, Mr. Stone, and you have the floor.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Let me bring up my presentation here. It's good to be with you all again. I always enjoy the opportunity to talk with the Committee on the Family here. It's important work. Families are, they're the building blocks for the societies that we all inhabit. And within the family, there are a lot of processes. Raising children, aging, household formation, marriage, all these things. But of course, what I want to focus on today is mostly going to be fertility. Not exclusively, as you'll see, but I am going to focus on fertility because all those other family processes, marriage, household formation, whatever, they can't happen if you're not born first. So we're gonna focus on fertility today. Now, before I get too much into this, everyone here is interested in the processes that are happening at the United Nations for obvious reasons. This is a UN adjacent organization. So I want to briefly comment on the productive role that the UN has in a lot of these conversations. And that's essentially as a facilitator of dialogue, a disseminator of information. So for example, this is a chart I really like. This uses the UN's World Population Policy database and looks at the share of countries in each year who said they were trying to raise or lower their fertility rates, right? Simple question. You can see over time, there have been a lot more countries trying to lower their fertility rates than raise them, because as Caroline made very clear, especially in the past, fertility rates were rather high. Now, in recent years, that gap has closed some. And I think we're going to continue to see it closing in the future for the simple reason that there are more countries, there are a growing number of countries with low fertility and a shrinking number of countries with high fertility. In the future, we're going to see more and more countries interested in raising their fertility rates. And so I think that should give us a sense of what kinds of guidance that countries are going to be interested in and need help with in the future. In the future, there are going to be fewer countries coming to UNFPA or UNPD, or even other, you're going to see fewer instances related to like UNHCR's concerns, dealing with contraception, abortion, and efforts to reduce fertility. In the future, what we're going to see is more demand from countries on advice, expertise, and suggestions on how to properly handle the question of low fertility, and in particular, how to achieve higher fertility rates. This is a question more and more countries have. It's only going to grow in the future. So the question is what to do about it. So if demand for antenatal policy advice and expertise is falling, and if demand for pronatal policy advice and expertise is rising, what should we make of that? Well, UNFPA just put out their 2023 State of the World Population Report last month. There's a lot of wonderful stuff in this report. It actually does a wonderful job talking about kind of the dual problems with kind of the too many people or the too few people framings of population policy. But on this question of countries' demand for policy advice, many countries don't have local expertise sufficient to design and implement effective policies. What this report primarily did was chastise nations for trying to raise or lower their fertility rates, right? Fertility targets were strongly critiqued in this report. It didn't give a lot of guidance on policy best practices, like if a country was determined to adopt a target, there was very little guidance given on how to do it in the best way or in the most effective way. And finally, the main focus of the report was actually on rhetorical issues. So I can give you an example from the website, right? The core element of the report is about changing the narrative, right? That this report primarily suggested that what we need to do about population is change the way we talk about it. Now, I think that's very valuable advice for journalists. I think for policymakers, though, there's a question of however we talk about this, what should the law be? what should policy be? So as we go forward, I think one of my first takeaway that I want listeners to get from this is that one thing UN members could consider is giving clearer guidance to UN organizations that deal with population, which, by the way, includes HCR, since refugees are a significant element of migration. And to basically give explicit advice that they'd like to see reports contain evidence-based advice on how to achieve specific policy goals. If you want to lower your fertility, what are some good ways to do it? If you want to raise your fertility, what are some good ways to do it? So I think that's one takeaway is members could ask for these bodies to give evidence-based advice on how to affect member-defined goals. Right now, that's not most of what we see. So let's go to fertility itself. Declining fertility. What is it all about? This graph shows what's called a net reproduction rate. This is from the 2022 World Population Prospects, an invaluable publication from UNPD that all of us who are demographers really depend on. The net reproduction rate you might not be familiar with. It's not just the fertility rate. It's essentially the number of daughters that a woman would have that would survive to adulthood if current mortality rates, sex-selective abortion rates, fertility rates, all these things remain stable. If it's below 1, it means in the long run, a population is likely to decline without immigration. If it's above 1, likely to grow. What you can see is in the UN-defined more developed regions, this number has been below 1 for several decades. Growth in more developed countries has mostly been fueled by immigration and population momentum and rising life expectancy. In the less developed regions of the world, this number remains above 1. There's still, on the whole, population growth through fertility, but it is declining. And then I have 2 different lines. Now, unfortunately, I'm seeing on my PowerPoint that my lines have smushed together. You'll notice there's a place where the 2 lines diverge. The sort of dotted line is the actual world population prospects projection. The line under that dotted line is where I've just taken the trend from 2012 to 2022 and extended it. So what's going on here is the UN's projection, which is very reasonable. I want to be clear. This is not saying there's a bad projection. It's a very reasonable projection. Is that there will be some convergence in the long run between more developed and less developed regions. However, while that's a totally reasonable view, there is an alternative view that I think members will want to consider, which is the possibility that the trends of the last decade will continue for another decade or 2. This is not a guarantee. It's not like this will happen, but it's something important to keep in mind is that the trends of the last decade could continue. So if they did, what would happen? And we see what would happen is that by 2031, the less developed regions would have a net reproduction rate below 1. And the more developed regions would very rapidly be approaching 0.5, which at 0.5 essentially means that without immigration, that each generation will shrink by half, approximately. So takeaway number 2, if marriage, contraception, fertility, sex-selective abortion, and child mortality trends from 2012 to 2022 continue, which they're not guaranteed to, but if they continue, then the developing world will fall below long-run population balance around 2031. That doesn't mean population decline will set in 2031, because you still have rising life expectancies, population momentum, all these things. But that point of moving towards long-run population imbalance would arrive within the next decade if the trends of the last decade continue. Now I want to zoom in a little bit and look at how this works out in more detail. So this is data from 5 surveys in India called the NFHS. There's a very large survey of family patterns in India. The red line is women's desired family size. So these surveys ask women how many children they want to have. The light blue line is the total fertility rate, the number of children women are likely to have if birth rates remain stable. What you can see is, like in 1993, women in India had about 3.4 children on average. Desired family size was about 2.8 or 2.9. So women were having excess children they perhaps did not intend to have. That gap kind of shrinks a little bit over time until by 2016, these numbers are equal. And in 2021, the light blue line is below the red line, meaning women had fewer children in India than they said they wanted. But now I want to draw your attention to the dark blue line. This is if you take those children likely to be born, but then account for child mortality. Some children die. How many children are women likely to have who actually make it to age 15? And there you can see that dark blue line is actually very close to the red line. In other words, over time, the actual number of children that women were likely to raise in India has been fairly close to desired fertility until in the last 5 to 8 years or so, it has fallen appreciably below desired fertility. Women now in India are likely to raise fewer children than they report desiring. And in fact, women in India today are likely to raise fewer than 2 children, i.e. India is below replacement, which I think is not the image many people have of Indian fertility today. That might be surprising for some. This is just one example, but my point is low fertility is not only the province of high-income countries. So low or negative long-run population growth prospects are not limited to high-income countries. It is not crazy to think huge swaths or even the entire developing world could have a net reproduction rate at or below 1 in the next decade. India is already there, and that's a big share of the developing world right there. Sub-Saharan Africa is really your only holdout. And with that, let's look at this. Here I've taken about 12 or 1,300 surveys taken around the world, different surveys, merged them together where we ask women, how many children do you want to have, or various questions like that, to estimate desired fertility in as many countries as possible. The white spaces are countries that I didn't have recent data for. And then we just compare that to current fertility and say, are you having more or fewer children than you say you want? Countries that are red are countries where women are having fewer children than they say they want. Countries that are blue are countries where they're having more than they say they want. You'll notice almost everywhere is red. Now, some of these surveys might be a few years out of date, so it's possible they could have declined a bit. The red might be a little bit overstated just due to issues with survey timing, but the broad conclusions are going to be about the same. Now, there are actually more blue countries than it looks like, but a lot of them are small. So several of the Pacific Island countries still have considerably higher fertility than women report desiring, but you can't see them on the map because they're very small. But what I want to point out is that actually women having fewer children than they want is very common throughout the world. This is most of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that doesn't mean that these women only want more children, right? Some of these women might have unmet contraceptive demand and want to have more children, right? They might want to be able to control the spacing of their births more rigorously while still having more children than they're actually likely to have. So this isn't just saying there's no problem of unintended fertility. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying on the whole, around the world, in almost every country, women are likely to have fewer children than they report desiring to have. To me, and I should say this is one place where that recent UNFPA report I pointed out does a very good job. This is a problem of reproductive autonomy. If people have a right to control their fertility and to have the number, spacing, and timing of children that they want, if that's a right, then this is a problem, a serious one, I think. That in almost every country, women are considerably undershooting their fertility. There are more countries in the world where women are having more than 1 child fewer than they desire than there are where they are having more children than they desire. And I should also note, this is a problem that doesn't map onto our sort of high income, low income model, right? This is a map where high income countries are failing just as much as low income countries. So this is not an indicator that is, let's say, biased in favor of high income countries. So in all, my fourth big takeaway, thing to take home with you is that in all high income and many low income countries, women will have fewer children than they say they desire to have. Now, Here, I want to get to the question of what's going to happen in the future. So this uses World Population Prospects projections of Korean fertility from the 1992 World Population Prospects to the 2022 one. So the red line is what actually happened with Korean fertility. And then those blue lines are successive rounds of population prospect projections. Now, there's no reason to think that projections should be perfectly accurate. And all projections involve making model assumptions that simplify reality. It is not an indictment of a projection that it ends up being not perfectly accurate. But I want to notice that there's a consistent issue for a country like Korea. And it's that the model always assumes, and has for decades, that Korea's fertility is eventually going to converge with some higher rate that's going to drift towards normalcy. In fact, what we've observed is Korean fertility never drifted towards normalcy. It just kept falling. So going forward, is Korean fertility about to start drifting towards normalcy? Maybe, or maybe it's just going to continue falling. And I think this is something to keep in mind, is that on the whole, successive iterations of the World Population Prospects do an excellent job of forecasting global population, and they do a very good job of forecasting the pace of fertility decline in high fertility countries. But because the world has less experience of patterns of change in low fertility countries, it's an area where our models are still learning how to project it accurately. And so for low fertility countries, I think it's important to understand that the degree of accuracy that something like the World Population Prospects can promise is limited. And so we need to keep in mind that we can't just trust that there will be a drift towards normalcy. Another example I like is Finland. Here I've only shown the 2006 forecast just as an example. You can see that since 2006, for a few years, actual fertility did track with the forecast, but then in recent years, it's dipped considerably below that forecast. And we see this in a lot of lower fertility countries, that fertility has just been a lot lower than expected. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that low fertility countries may be on unique trajectories. So takeaway number 5, in high income, low fertility countries, fertility rebound is not yet happening in the way that the UN has expected. It might begin to happen soon. It hasn't happened on a great scale yet. So the reason for that is that the core drivers of low fertility have not turned around. So what are those drivers? We can think about things like improved contraceptive efficacy, right? People are using more effective forms of contraception, using it more widely. We can think about delayed marriage. People are getting married later, and and more people are not getting married at all. The cost of raising children is rising in almost every country in the world. These things aren't changing. I don't think that there's any reason to think that any of those indicators are going to change in the future. Marriage is likely to continue being delayed. Marriage rates overall are likely to continue declining. Contraceptive usage is not likely to dramatically decline. The cost of raising children, I'm raising children right now. I can tell you it doesn't look like it's about to decline, at least not in Canada where I live. And finally, women face rising opportunity costs. As women achieve not just parity in the workplace, but in education and in many workplace environments, as women supersede men's accomplishments, which in many ways is something to celebrate. Nonetheless, around the world, even in highly egalitarian countries like Denmark and Norway, large shares of women take time away from work to raise children. In many cases, they do so not because they're forced to, but because they want to. And I'm not going to sit in judgment over that. You know, if women want to stay in the workplace and have their child in childcare, I'm not going to judge that. If they want to be home with their kid, I'm not going to judge that. The point is, in every society we know of, there are a lot of women who voluntarily choose to stay, who would like to stay home with their kids. But the opportunity cost, the lost income of doing so, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as women's wages are rising and men's wages are not rising at the same rate. The upshot of this is that it's harder to find a suitable mate. It's harder to consumption smooth from that lost income. And so on the whole, fertility falls. And again, that's unlikely to change in the near future. Now, I do want to emphasize the marriage bit. I'm not going to go into this too much because we're on limited time, but if you want more info, I have a link here to a report I and a co-author recently published where we did a pretty exhaustive look at the marriage question. Because a lot of people have a perception that marriage is no longer really important for fertility trends because of rising non-marital fertility. But this is just not true. This map shows completed fertility among women who ever married versus those who never married across European countries that I had data for. And what I want you to see is that in every single country here is colored blue. That means women who ever married had higher fertility than women who never married. Now, you might say, oh, well, it's lighter blue in some of the more egalitarian countries like Sweden. But even in Sweden, ever married women had 0.4 children more than never married women. Now, when your baseline fertility rate is 1.6, 1.7, 0.4 is a big gap. That's a very large effect of marriage. Around the world, in every society, married people have more fertility. Fertility rises when people get married. And there is no country on earth that manages to have marital fertility, births in marriage contributing fewer than 1.5 children per woman, and yet have overall fertility at replacement. If marital fertility is falling below 1.5 children per woman, there is no way you are going to have replacement rate fertility. There's nowhere on earth that accomplishes it. Marital fertility remains the core driver of overall fertility. And so as marriage declines, fertility declines. So delayed marriage and less marriage overall are the core drivers of fertility change, which is, it's not really a trendy explanation, I'll say, because it's sort of an unpopular explanation because it's a hard thing to move. But the reality is, in every country, married people have more kids. So fertility, in my view, is not very likely to rebound, which means a hard landing is coming. Population isn't going to decline tomorrow. It's not to decline 20 years from now on the global scale. It might not decline 30 or 40 years from now. But in my view, it's very possible that I will live to see population decline globally. And when it declines, it's likely to decline relatively rapidly. And of course, in some countries, it is already declining very rapidly. So what is to be done? Unfortunately, we have very limited evidence on cost-effective pronatal policies. If you're a country and you want to boost your fertility rate, there is not a demonstrated toolkit to show you how to increase it by a meaningful amount at a reasonable cost. This is unfortunate. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean we have no evidence. A lot of countries have tried pronatal policy, and the academic research on this suggests that government efforts to boost birth rates are usually moderately successful. They might boost birth rates by 0.1 children per woman or 0.2 children per woman, but it often comes at a very high price tag. So my point is not to say we have no idea how to increase fertility, but that we don't currently have a reliable way to do it by a large amount at a reasonable price in a way that's consistent with, human liberty, freedom, and reproductive autonomy. So my last takeaway for you is, instead of trying to replicate some existing policy toolkit, pronatal countries, that is, countries who have fertility lower than what women say they want and that are interested in helping women achieve their fertility goals, they should experiment with lots of different policies and then carefully study the results. And I think good areas to begin experimenting would be on housing, educational timelines, and marriage. I think that those are useful focal points to explore policy experiments that can then be studied. And then if we find things that work at helping people to achieve their goals, then those could be shared by, for example, UN policy bodies across countries so that we can learn from each other around the world. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Lyman. That is amazing, interesting, and quite sobering to realize that we're looking at some potential challenges, some big ones going forward. I encourage everyone to please put your questions into the chat. If you feel like you would like to take the microphone, that would be okay also. I am going to begin and take moderator's privilege and ask each one of you a question. Also, Lyman and Caroline, if you would like to respond to one another's presentation, do you want to take a minute to do that, or do you think it would be handled just within the Q&A? And do either of you have a feeling? Would you like to give any kind of...
Yeah, for
Go
me
ahead, Bob.
personally, I don't need to, I got to go second anyways, so I don't think I need to make a response. I don't know
Okay.
if Caroline.
Caroline? Oh,
Yeah, no, maybe no, but I think maybe, you know, yes, I think we agree that we should provide any opportunities, government, housing, support, balancing work, life, family, to really allow couples, families to have the children they want. I think we all agree, and we know some countries have done so and have seen a slight uptick. But oftentimes, I think we have to distinguish between, I think amongst us, demographics, cohort, and period fertility. Sometimes it's a tempo effect where then people see, you know, I plan to buy a car, or I want to take a mortgage on and buy property. Then you take advantage of it now, but we then would have to look into, will they really have more children, or do we see an uptick because in the average over a period? But we then have to look at the cohort, look at the women's reproductive lifetime, and to see, did they indeed have more children, or did they just advance the children? And that gives you the period average is then higher, but the cohort average might be the same or still declining. And we have actually done, one of the colleagues, she is on the call listening in, and they have actually looked at period and cohort fertility, where we clearly see there is an uptick in some parts of the world. There's a positive response, but sometimes, as I said, and circumstances changes, governments change, they lose elections, somebody else comes in, and these incentives are not permanent. So women, families take advantage of it, and then, you know, it's no longer available, then they do what they do. So it's a very complicated matter, a very tricky situation, and controlling fertility, as we know, in some parts of the world has been sometimes more successful than it's cultural issues. There are a lot of dynamics that make women, families to decide to have or not to have children. I leave it at that. So I think that's one of the main points I would like to make. Thank you.
Yeah,
Right.
I absolutely agree with all of that. And for those not familiar with it, the idea of the period and cohort is that we do sometimes have these policies that are implemented, and fertility rates jump up, and they say, oh, it's working. But then 3 years later, they're down again. We say, what happened? And it's just that people shifted when they had children, which for a government, you know, can be a kind of policy success because it shortens a generational timeline. But for an individual, okay, it's not necessarily a big success for an individual's life course. So
yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So here's my question. Caroline, you mentioned that the total number of births has remained really stable over time, yet the number of children born per woman has fallen. Can you explain a little bit that dynamic? What are the factors that would make the total number of births remain stable over time, but yet the actual number of children born per woman is falling? So there's one for you. And I see in the chat some similar ones to what I'm about to ask Lyman in regard to delayed marriage, less marriage, rising cost of children. So if I'm understanding Lyman correctly, the countries that are looking at pronatalist policies and efforts and spending lots of money doing so, that they actually, perhaps the money is misplaced, the funding is misplaced, and they should be taking a bigger look at increasing marriage rates. Is that what I heard? So there's some other ones in here. We'll just go first with Caroline and answer, if you would, why total number of births has remained stable.
Well, I think it's it's a mathematical issue here. Of course, the total number of women has grown, and if you have that as a denominator, then you have a smaller number of average children. But we also have to look at. So I think that is the mathematical equation. The denominator is just larger, and you have a total number of births, and you have more women, and you divide the total number of births through a larger number of women, then you have smaller
Then you
total
still have,
fertility rate. But I think it's just, I found it interesting because sometimes we just get bogged down on one indicator, total fertility, and that is what we all look at. But we have to also look maybe one point more to also look at the parity fertility, to see that some women, more and more women have no children, but often those who have one child also have a second child. So we have to look much more in depth into what is happening at the subnational level, different groups of women, different groups of families, and what makes it possible to have children, and what makes it impossible for some women, for all kinds of reasons, not to have children. I think we have to understand more of that to really be successful in the policy formulation, to see how can we really facilitate families to have the size of the family, the number of children they want.
And I think the question for me was about pronatal policy, essentially areas for that. Is that correct?
right, and
Yeah.
let me read some of them from the chat.
No, I flipped through.
Can you see them? Yeah, if you can see the ones in the chat.
Yeah,
Lynn,
so I think so when I say marriage is a major leverage point, then it gets to, okay, so like, is marriage even something that you can, or even if you can, should you do any policy related to marriage, right? It's not like, ideally you want married people to be in love, right? Not just taking a tax benefit. So how do you do a policy for marriage, right? What does that even mean? And I think here there's actually a very productive place to start. And it's that most countries have policies that give benefits to lower income people, and those policies phase out as your income rises, right? This is a common policy design that almost every country has. In practice, in almost every country, with how those programs are designed, if two low income people who both get those benefits marry each other, it tends to be the case that their joint policy benefit is lower than the sum of their two individual policy benefits. The term for this is what we call a marriage penalty. It's kind of a complicated calculation to do, and I won't bore you with all the math, but suffice to say, right now, we have a situation where in most countries, the government is essentially sort of putting its thumb on the scale against particularly lower income people getting married. Not because there's an intentional anti-marriage whatever, but because just an incidental feature of program design in a lot of social welfare programs is that they perhaps disproportionately provide aid to single people or to single moms, for example, or to widows or any of these things. It tends to be the case that when people get married, societies define them as less vulnerable, either explicitly or implicitly through their spouse's income. As a result, getting married causes people to lose benefits, which is effectively an implied tax on marriage. It's what economists will call an implicit marginal tax rate. The upshot of this is, like in the US, where I'm from, when a working class couple gets married, they can lose benefits that are worth more than their total market income, right? So they lose, more than half of their real income when they get married, merely because they married. And so if you look around the world, you'll find that marriage, or not around the world, if you look in high income countries, you'll find that marriage has fallen the most among less educated and lower income people. And I believe a considerable part of that is that an unintended side effect of how most countries have designed their social welfare states is that they have created marriage penalties. So fixing those marriage penalties is a first step to a a pronatal marriage policy. That's not about, trying to make people get married. Not the goal there. It's just recognizing that we have a penalty on marriage already. We should remove it. That's discriminatory towards working class married people. Beyond that, you can think about other things. Why do marriage rates rise in June and July after people graduate from university or from a master's degree or a PhD? It's because people postpone marriage until they're done with their education. But that's a social norm that doesn't have, like, getting married in the April of your senior year versus the June after is not like a big economic, it's not like there was a huge economic change. Marriage timelines are often sensitive to things that have very little to do with economic or material status. Thinking about how we structure education and the incentives we give institutions to essentially keep their students single it would also be a productive avenue to explore.
Thank you. I think you addressed, Susan Roylance had a question about education, how that impacts that. So thank you for covering that to some degree. I understand that in countries like Germany, they are working at condensing the amount of time it takes to get a degree, and they see that as a possibility for.
Yeah, I mean, where I live in Quebec, schooling, you finish school anywhere from 1 to 3 years earlier than in the other provinces of Canada, depending on how far along you go. And no surprise, Quebec has higher fertility than the rest of Canada. And sometimes it's attributed to other parts of the social welfare state here, but personally, I think the earlier educational completion is actually a very important part of what makes Quebec unique.
Thank you. I'm going to go back up to the top. We have a question. What are the societal and governmental issues that might arise if the world does trend toward a 0.5 fertility rate?
I should say 0.5 here would be a net reproduction rate. 0.5 fertility rate would be really low. A 0.5 net reproduction rate would be approximately a fertility rate of like 1.1.
So it's 1.1. Caroline, do you want to take a minute and take a shot at that one, and then we'll have Lyman?
Sure. Well, I would say, well, changes happen very slow. And as we spoke about population aging, not all fertility decline is a bad thing. I think we have to look at the entire population. We can look at countries. We also see what are the benefits of having smaller population. It doesn't mean we go extinct right away. So there are different challenges. There are new opportunities that a change age structure provides to countries. So it gives new ways of thinking, and we look at Japan, we look at other countries where we see they go right on, they promote healthier lives. They look at, you have more resources to provide healthcare, education. You can focus more on quality. So there are a lot of opportunities. The environmental footprint at some point will be smaller. So there are a lot of new ideas, new perspectives that can be developed if you have indeed slowly declining populations.
Thank you. Lyman, do you have a thought there?
No, I mean, I think, declining population it is a gradual process, right? It's there's no country in the world today that has any risk of like going extinct, in this century. Nobody alive today is going to see the last Korean or something. So I think when we think about risks, we're not talking about an extinction risk. That said, I do want to emphasize a slow population decline is sometimes manageable. A fast population decline can be very hard to deal with. So for example, if your country is looking at losing 20% of its population, 1% of population a year, that is very difficult to deal with because you have to restructure a lot of infrastructure very rapidly. Now, right now, that's rather few countries that have that pace of decline. But restructuring that amount of infrastructure in terms of, abandoning towns, shutting down schools, reallocating workers, altering funding programs for old age pensions, reallocating health resources, these kinds of things. This is an administratively very difficult task, and most governments do not have the state capacity to achieve it seamlessly. Japan is kind of a unique case because that's a society with extraordinarily high sort of state capacity, social solidarity, all these things. Will India be able to reallocate resources that quickly when their population begins to decline in 40
That's some
years?
time to go.
Sure, it's 40
I had to
years.
interject here.
It is some time to go, but
We
they're
still have.
but they're hitting replacement rate at $20,000 of income less per person, which means they're going to hit aging, they're going to hit their peak population with far fewer resources per capita. And also they won't be able to benefit from immigrants, right? The high income countries today benefit from immigrants to soften the blow because there's other countries that have high fertility. But by the time India or, I don't know, Kenya in 150 years or 100 years are peaking, they'll have a very different set of burdens. Now, maybe by then we'll have fully automated robots to take care of everything, right? Maybe. I hope so. That'll assuming they don't overpower
I think
us.
just one point to make is also, in some particularly Eastern European country, we have seen a lot of out-migration, and then you have a certain population decline due to fertility, something different than out-migration. And then, of course, you have had it after the Second World War. Some of the countries, and I know it from my own country, Germany, where we benefited from a lot of people coming then from Italy, but then from Turkey, from the Maghreb, where these countries also suffered the loss. And we know when the wall came down, we had a lot of people from Hungary, from Poland, from Eastern Europe leaving, and even from Eastern Germany, so you had. And then you had a population decline, a rapid decline, because you lost. And then I fully agree. Then these countries have to cope with the brain drain. They have to cope with the loss of, and it has an impact on marriage market. Maybe we have another session. I worked in the Caribbean, and you have migration and the impact on marriage market. Absolutely amazing in small society what it really means. When you have a marriage squeeze, either you have less of one sex in relation to another. What are the implications? I think these are very interesting and very important dynamics that need to be taken into consideration, and to really prepare and to cope is very difficult. Absolutely.
Thank you to both of you. We have with us a representative from the mission of Hungary, Magnolia. Magnolia, would you like to take the floor for just a couple of minutes? And Hungary is in the news and in the media a lot, and address some of the questions raised from the perspective of Hungary. I hope she's still on. Okay,
yes,
there you are.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And apologies that my camera is not working. I have been listening attentively to this fascinating presentation. I work at the Hungarian mission covering family policies, social policies, and gender equality. And I was very much inspired by your discussion, because this is exactly the issues that the Hungarian government is also grappling with, the aging population, and what was mentioned by Lyman, that actually surveys show nationally that women do would prefer to have more children that they actually end up having. So this is also an individual demand from the people, and also a requirement to fight population aging, which has a heavy toll on the society and the economy. And what the government has been trying to do, of course, there is limits to what governments can do, because we don't want to create limits. We want to create incentives and support for people to to make their choices better and their options larger. And one of the things that the government has been doing was related to marriage, because we do see that marriage is really the ideal place to raise children, and indeed there is a cost of entering to marriage. So there is a lot of government policies that are specifically tied to married couples, including housing subsidies, very generous tax returns, even car allowances. So all those things that incentivize couples to get married at an earlier age, and supports them funding children early. Also, the age of motherhood, we have been seeing, is being delayed and delayed. So what the government is trying to do is really to incentivize young people to have children at a younger age, by which I mean by the time they exit university. So for example, the parental leave for women counts into their pension years. So the time they spend at home with children is actually not taken out from their active years when the pension allowance is calculated at the end of their career. So this is also one way to assure them that this is really time well spent and invested in something important. Then I was very, very interested to hear from Lyman about the challenges of having a family policy being a social policy, targeting people with lower income. And this has also been an issue with Hungary, causing, people having children as a way of income, which also comes, of course, to the detriment of care undertaking. And really what the government has done is that they have a two-pronged approach. We have social policy that targets every individual on the basis of their financial situation and social circumstances. But family policy is actually not related or not primarily related to income. So for example, we have a tax allowance or tax return for families having 2 or more children. And this tax return, of course, comes with the fact that people have to be employed. So they incentivize employment aside from having children. And also, of course, if you have a bigger income, you have a bigger quantity of tax returns. So it really doesn't depend on the socio-economic status of people. And this way, we could really reach a larger number of the population and incentivize them to have more children. Also, women, for example, who have 4 or more children are tax-free until the end of their lives. So this is again to alleviate this burden of poverty that comes with children. And finally, speaking about percentages, I really do feel what was mentioned, that there is a huge investment from governments, and the return or the results are sometimes not as much as we would like them to see. For example, Hungary spends more than 5% of its annual GDP on family policies, which is a huge amount even within OECD countries. And we have started to see a positive trend, which was the fertility rate increased from 1.2% 10 years ago to 1.5%. It has been a steady increase, and of course it has to play out still, but at least we see now a changing trend, and also a change in people's preferences and priorities in really prioritizing also their personal life and their family life over their careers. And my final point would be that this is, I think, the most difficult part, because there is limitations to what governments can do to regulate the labor market, employment opportunities, and the employment sector. But Hungary actually does have very strong policies that all companies have to abide by in terms of parental leave, in terms of job protection, not being able to fire women who get pregnant or who are on parental leave, which can have an endurance until 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. So it's really substantive time. But also the government is trying to award workplaces that are family friendly. So really to reach out to the private sector and really create a value in those companies who do support families and who really take up this role of supporting especially mothers with young children. So those would be the small points I wanted to add to the discussion. And thank you so much again for sharing your views. It is incredibly helpful for me as a member state representative to have all the numbers and to see what works, what doesn't work, and all the trends on the long term. So big thank you and congratulations for the event.
Thank you, Magnolia. We're out of time, but I want to wrap it up by giving both of the speakers an opportunity to give some final quick comments. Let's go ahead, Lyman, we'll start with you. And Caroline, we'll give you the last word.
I think my final comment would actually be very much dovetailing with what we just heard from the member of the mission from Hungary, which is, Hungary is a great example because it has been so contentious in the international media, right? There are people who think its family policies are the greatest thing ever, and then you see media reports saying, oh, it's not good for this or that reason. It's very contentious. My concern is that this is a place where what's really going on is Hungary is a country that had low fertility and wanted to do something about it. And there was no template out there for what to do, right? It's not like they could go to UNFPA or UNPD and be like, hey, we want to raise our fertility. What's a good toolkit for how a country can raise its fertility, right? That toolkit didn't exist. And so Hungary had to find its own way and enact policies that, again, some people love, some people don't. I'm not here to say if they're good or bad, right? Just what we need is, as more countries are encountering low fertility, we need to be developing that toolkit so that we can have a commonly accepted, not too controversial set of policies that a country can adopt and have a reasonably good hope that it will, in fact, increase fertility by a reasonable amount at a reasonable price. Countries shouldn't have to go through, a million rounds of experimentation under the harsh light of international media, which is hard for any policymaker to figure out what works, right? We should be able to supply a set of policies. And I think that this is a place where there needs to be more development in the future, more research, and ultimately there's a really valuable dissemination function, I think, for UN affiliated organizations. So I would leave that as my takeaway from this is we really need experimentation, dissemination, and a way to normalize a productive and rights-based approach to the growing problem of low fertility.
Thank you. Great advice. I hope we can be a part of that process, and this committee certainly could take that on as something to promote once we can identify what those actually are. So we need everyone's help. Caroline.
Well, thanks for giving me the last word in this round. I think, as I have said before, I think what we definitely have to do is provide couples, families with the opportunities, and there is no one size fits all. And we at the UN, we have countries come to us and say, what do? We have Eastern Europeans, we are in consultation with a wide range of countries. You talk Chinese, we had a conference in Korea looking at Asian countries. There are very different mechanisms at play than if you go to Hungary, or if you go to Germany, or if you go to South Africa. So where we come from is provide opportunities for men, for women, depending on the culture, on the circumstances, to really support childcare, support balancing family, work life, provide healthcare, provide family planning, and give couples the opportunity, the framework for them then to take the decision what they want to do. It's a personal decision, and my personal view is not up to governments. I think it's up to me, my partner, the family, to decide where we want to go. And for that, and of course, if we decide to have more children, it would be great. If we decide not to have more children, that's great as well. So I think that definitely needs to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for a great event and presentation. We've got some work to do, and thank you for your time. Thank you for all of you who have joined us. And this will be our last Zoom event, our last event for this 2022-23 season, and we'll start back again in October. Please go to the website. It's there in the chat, and join us. We'd love to have your input and help with this great effort. So thank you to everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.